My name is Ted Diers, and I am the administrator of the Watershed Management Bureau at the Department of Environmental Services here in New Hampshire. I have been with the state for 24 years, and before that, worked in nonprofit world for a little while. I have an undergraduate degree in economics and a master's degree in forest hydrology from the Yale School of Forestry, which is now called something else. I don't know. They changed the name, but anyway, and they changed the name of my master's. I don't know, whatever. They do this to you over time. So the Watershed Management Bureau, just for your edification, is essentially the part of DES that deals with surface water quality. We don't really do wetlands. We don't do groundwater. We pretty much do lakes, ponds, rivers, estuaries, ocean. Programs there include lots and lots and lots of different things, about 20 different programs, from monitoring water quality to certifying permits that they meet water quality standards, 401 certifications. We have our non-point source program. We do shellfish regulation, beaches. We do lakes and rivers management. We write TMDLs. We do our biennial assessment to Congress of our water quality. And, you know, my favorite program, of course, is our cement ponds program, the pools and spas inspection program, because, hey, that's surface water. I ought to have that one too. And anyway, so we have a smattering of lots of things, including our coastal program, which is our coastal zone management program, which isn't sort of exclusively surface waters, you know, in terms of water quality, but it fits well actually within the whole framework of the Bureau. So today I have the great fortune of being able to torture you for a little while with some of the work that I do. And so let's jump in here. Great. So this is what I plan to do. I want to actually start with the questions at the bottom, because these were some of the things that I think Michael posed to me, thinking about how to look at kind of what we do from a water quality resource, water resource perspective. And the first one is, how do we link up the science and the law together? Because that's really what we do every day. And it's not just our laws, it's also federal laws and sometimes local laws. And, you know, sometimes people like to push back on those laws. And so how do we think about that? And what does that mean for us in these various different contexts? So, you know, this is really a lot of the challenge that we do on a daily basis is thinking through these things. But I do want to focus, because I think Michael is, you know, got a lot of experience in that, is that we really do try to make decisions based on the science in front of us. And it isn't always the science you want. It's not all the science you can get. It's never perfect, but you have to make decisions anyway. And sometimes the best you can do is the best you can do, either from how you enact some change based on that science, or how good a science you can actually make. So we'll talk about some of those things, I think, as we go through. And I think one of the things that I hope that you will, so these are the questions I hope you'll keep in your mind, and you'll, you know, poke me every once in a while and say, hey, did you really answer this? And one of them is this linkages piece. The other piece is, so is it actually working? Like, are we actually being effective? And so I think those are really important questions to ask all the way through this. I can talk forever, but this, you know, really ought to be about what you want to know, as well as what I want to tell you. And this is a small enough group that just mute yourself and mute your bad self, and just holler out if you have a question, or you want me to stop, or you want me to slow down, or you have some compelling interest that you know, want to know a different thing about what I'm talking about. So we'll go as far as we can, and I will get as far as we can. So if we don't get all the way through, that's okay. We'll have fun and we'll just kind of go through this. So that's my plan. If that's okay with everybody, we will just we'll jump in. So Michael, anything else for introduction that you wanted to hear?
Your previous role at CZM.
So yeah, so my career here at the department. My first job was I started out in our coastal zone management group, which we call the New Hampshire Coastal Program. And I started out, I did 8 years of habitat restoration. So I worked on salt marsh restoration projects. I worked on dam removal kinds of projects. And then from there, I went on to become the director of the coastal program. And from there, I ended up in this position as the administrator of the Watershed Management Bureau. Where do I go from here? I don't know. I think only down. But no, I have a great job. One other thing about, I guess, the Watershed Bureau that I should have mentioned is that we have about 45 people in the Bureau who I oversee, and largely scientists, a couple of engineers, a few managers here and there, but it's largely a science organization. So it's really a joy. I have very, very, very few problem children amongst that group. They're extraordinary humans. So jumping in, I'm going to just jump right in and start talking about some of these issues. So the issues that I want to focus on, sort of be categorized. Some are more specific than others. The first one is chlorides, because I think it is going to be, if it's not already, one of the most important water quality issues facing New Hampshire over the next decades. The second is resilience. And this is, really resilience to a lot of things that are changing in the environment, and understanding a little bit more about what does that mean for us and how do we deal with it. And then I'll end up with some a tale about nutrients, and we'll kind of go from there. So I'm just going to jump in and we will get rolling. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the ringers on my phones. Sorry.
Being the administrator, his phones go off a lot.
Yeah, unfortunately. And if we learned nothing else from Hillary, use 2 phones. So to jump in here first, I'll start talking about chlorides. And again, please, 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 just jump in, anybody who wants to interrupt, because it's hard for me to see all of you at once. I want to hear your voices as well as I have to hear my own all the time. So this is I-93. I think everyone's probably familiar with that. It is that piece of highway which links the metro Boston area to our lakes and mountains through New Hampshire. And I just point out a couple of things from this slide. One is that we have really nice lakes and mountains. So it's no wonder that people want to go there. But I just want you to look at the population differential between just the metro Boston area and the entire state of New Hampshire. And think about how those people in New Hampshire, they're spread out amongst mostly the southern part of the state, and where people from Boston. So the market we have is clearly the Boston market. And this is really, I think this is one of my favorite maps. This is the map of where the state liquor stores are. So each one of those little dots is one of our state liquor stores. And you can tell very clearly and how dependent this state is. We have a monopoly on liquor. That's one of the sins that we support here that support all of our government is liquor. And so you can see that how many of those liquor stores fall into this corridor, and this is because of that. So one of the important pieces of Interstate 93 is that it really needs to get lots of people in on a Friday afternoon and lots of people out on a Sunday afternoon. And if you have been in this area for a while, you know that for a long time it was getting worse and worse and worse on those Fridays and Sundays, and also starting to get bad on Monday mornings and Tuesday mornings and Wednesday mornings as more and more people from New Hampshire, people from Boston moving to New Hampshire so that they could commute back to Boston to go to work. So this has been really the challenge, and so DOT set out to expand I-93, and this would double the size of the highway from 2 lanes each way to 4 lanes. It would have bigger on and off ramps and eventually include additional on and off ramps. Lots of park and rides so that we can get people to move in and out of there. An important thing as we start talking about chlorides is that the drainage on the entire system is going from an open system. That is, most of the drainage would just sort of go off the side of the road, or would go into, maybe little streams or other things, and never, through best management practices, never really get collected as stormwater. It would sort of just go off to the side. This has an impact, an interesting impact on chlorides, as opposed to things like phosphorus and TSS and bacteria and PAHs and other stuff. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And the other thing, I think, just this is clear, is that if you're going to have more lanes, you're going to put down more salt. And this is what became apparent in the early 2000s as we started to plan for this expansion of the highway. This is the graph that launched New Hampshire into the chloride issue. This one right here, this is collected. You can see that this is in February of 2000, January, February of 2004. And EPA, as they started thinking about the permitting for this expansion, went out and had data loggers out in some of the small streams out along the corridor, and also was taking chloride samples here and there. And so because you can see on the side of this curve, it says specific conductance, if you can see that well enough. Specific conductance is a measure of how well the water conducts electricity. And you can link that by taking lots of chloride samples. You can link the conductance to the chlorides, because chlorides are highly, as you know from salt water, they're highly conductive. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So you can see that we have these high levels of chloride that absolutely are well above what would be our acute and chronic chloride levels in these streams for our water quality standards. So a note about water quality standards. Our water quality standards are made up of 3 different things. They're made up of sort of criteria that you might think of in terms of these numbers, like for the acute chloride standard in New Hampshire is 230 milligrams per liter. They also have designated uses. And so that's another part of our water quality standards, is designated uses, which is those things for which the river is used for. So in the case of New Hampshire, we expect that these uses in the downstream waters will be sort of swimmable, fishable kinds of uses. There ought to be habitat for fish. They ought to be able to live here, and people ought to be able to recreate here. And maybe people ought to be able to take water from here to use for their purposes after they treat it. And then the third part of water quality standards is something called anti-degradation, which is a really big, scary word for a pretty simple concept that is really just, if it's bad, don't make it worse. If it's good, don't make it bad. And that's pretty much all it is. It's more complicated to apply than all of that, but that's the 3 parts of our water quality standards. So you can see that this clearly was violating our water quality standards. These are not pristine streams. This is Policy Brook. This is in Salem. And you can see that a couple of things for those of you who are looking carefully. You can see that it's been vastly it has been vastly manipulated. It's stuck in between walls. It's got lots of people, parking lots, houses right up to the edge. And it's got probably every invasive species that you can put into a riparian zone, probably sits in this riparian zone. But it's still got fish. and it's still got critters, and it's still designated use as something that you ought to be able to fish out of, as should have habitat. So as I mentioned, we had this data which would suggest that it doesn't meet water quality standards. So every 2 years we report to Congress on those water bodies that don't meet water quality standards. That goes on something cleverly titled the 303D 305B list, rolls right off the tongue. And we report that to Congress, and this has implications for people in certain contexts. And so here we have these 4 small watersheds you see in the blue, the green, the orange, and the yellow, if those are the same colors that you get off of your screen. And around the state, and I should update this because we have a brand new list that's about to go final, which is that we have a 50 now statewide chloride impairments. That is 50 different water bodies that don't meet our water quality standards. What the 303D list really is a list of waters that don't meet water quality standards and really do require a TMDL. So what's a TMDL? A TMDL is a total maximum daily load. And all it really means is how much do you have to reduce of some bad thing in order to get back to water quality standards? So you figure out how bad it is, and then you figure out what percentage you need to reduce to get down to your water quality criteria. And then you write this TMDL, which also has a safety margin in it, that gets you down to the point where you would actually meet water quality standards. So this is how we figure that out, is by using these flow duration curves, and you figure out, what was the pollution at different flows. And there's a couple of things I want to point out about this. One is that generally, when we saw water quality problems was not during when we had snow melting. So you can see here, and if I can move you all around a little bit on my screen so I can see it, that you see that the winter, we did have violations. Those are the black ones, but it generally was when we had the dry times during the winter, not when it was really, the water was really cranking. And most of the time when we had water quality violations was actually in the summer. Remember I talked about this having an open drainage system. Well, when the salt would melt, when the snow would melt and the salt with it would go off the side of the highway, it would just simply go into groundwater. And so at summertime, when there's really no flow, except for that which is coming out of the groundwater, that's sort of called base flow. That base flow is filled with salt. And therefore, what you get here is you get very high chloride levels during the summer and into the fall when we have the low flows. So this is really challenging because we don't see the problem when the salt is out there. We see the problem later on. And what's really scary about this is to think about how long it takes for water to flow through groundwater. It can take years, potentially decades. So what we're seeing here is a reflection of those land use practices. And I think that's always really important for people to understand, that when you're talking about base flow and summertime conditions, you're actually looking at what is the legacy of land use over the past decades. It's not just what was happening yesterday or today. And that's what you see here. So the TMDL was done, and then you had lots of reductions. So this is just a chart that shows some of the reductions, and we allocate them to different people, different sectors. And you can see the magnitude of the changes that need to be made. And you can see that under 4 lanes with DOT here, that they need to reduce what they're doing by about 12%. Why only 12%? So DOT, obviously, they've got the giant roads. They're the ones who are really, causing the problem here by expanding. But what you see here, I'll go back a second. What you see here is that most of the salt is actually coming from municipal roads, parking lots, things like that. So this is the challenge of how do we start to get ourselves around this problem. Not that DOT is not culpable in all of this. This is exit 3, for those of you who are familiar with Windham.
So
Go ahead.
how do you know that those, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So, so you must have monitoring points.
So this is, yeah, the way that this comes out, Michael, we had tons of monitoring. So we have tons of data. So we can basically create a mass balance. So this is basically using a mass balance. We have a very good understanding of what DOT is put down.
Mhm.
We have a really, really good understanding of what the municipalities are putting down. And we can also make some assumptions based on rates. So how much salt are they using, per lane mile?
Mhm.
And then that sort of helps us back into the private sector and
And
other things like water softeners and a few other things like that that go into this. So it's to some extent it's modeled, and to some extent it's measured, but that's how we come up with these numbers.
okay, great, thanks.
Basically mass balance, which is nice about salt because it's completely conservative. So it's actually relatively easy to do that. So anyway, I just want to show you that, we have exit 3, which looked like this in 2007. Nice, lots of, open areas. And now it is, looks like this. Just a little story. This is Cobbett's Pond. This is Canopy Lake over on the other side. Cobbett's Pond, basically there's a bunch of little streams and wetlands in here. It's called Dinsmore Brook. And because of all the blasting that went on in this area, the regression that we use that compares specific conductivity to chlorides went completely haywire, because all of a sudden it was basically blasted back to the Stone Ages. So we had lots of anions, cations that were flowing through this because they're related to really raw geology. So, this essentially was blasted back to primordial times, when the earth was new. So that's what we were measuring. And so the whole chloride thing kind of went out the window in an interesting way from a modeling perspective. But I digress. So what has happened? So DOT has implemented since 2007. It has implemented a lot of best management practices. They're using brine. So by using liquids, you do a couple of different things. You actually keep the snow from adhering to the pavement. And the other thing is that for those of you who are unaware of how salt actually works when you put it down, if you put a piece of rock salt on ice, it does absolutely nothing. Nothing. It does nothing. It's a piece of rock on a flat surface until it gets into solution. Once it gets into solution, then it has the potential to do some melting. So the idea is, how do you get this salt into solution faster so that you can get it working faster so you don't have to use as much? Some of the things that they're doing is they're pre-wetting the salt as it comes out of the truck. They're wetting it with some stuff that's a little sticky, basically high fructose corn syrup, that is in there. And that goes out and that starts the melting, and it keeps it on the pavement. It keeps it from most of the salt flinging off the sides. If you've ever watched salt trucks go down the road, most of it's bouncing around and flinging off the side. So those are some of the best management practices, and getting better about predicting winter, or predicting the storms as they go through and what they need to employ. So a whole bunch of different things that they've been doing, and they've documented. It's hard to tell from this because every winter is different, every storm is different, but they have documented that they've reduced their salt use by around 20% in this corridor.
I think if you did a moving average, I think it would really show it up.
Yeah, it's hard to tell from this, but yeah, it's very challenging to see. What you really have to do is compare it against what we have as a winter severity index, and you normalize it to that, and then you start to really see it. So I want to get back to this for a little bit. So we know the DOT's done some things, but how do you get at? But that's a tiny bit of the load. That's like 9% of the load. So how do we get at this piece? And so, you think about what's being affected? You've got obviously wildlife, you've got drinking water being affected across the state. We have roads and bridges that are falling apart because of the snow. The salt essentially leaches calcium out of the concrete and basically makes it weakened from, and they even find it sometimes it happens from the outside in. It's really scary. This is scary stuff with our infrastructure. And then it kills expensive landscaping and other things. But the vast majority of the load, again, this was modeled and mass balance kind of approach here, is from the private sector. And we don't have any really regulatory tools to deal with them. So what do? So what we did was we invented a thing called a salt applicator certification program, the Green Snow Pro program. And the point of it is to improve efficiency of salt use, decrease your costs because you're using less salt. And if you switch to brine, you also cut costs in other ways. Like if you pre-wet or if you pre-salt ahead of time using brine, you don't have to get people out as early in the morning. So if that snowstorm starts at 2 a.m., you may not have to get your guys out there. And I say guys because it's like 95, 99% plow guys until, maybe 4 a.m. So there's 2 hours of early morning wear and tear on humans that you don't have to incorporate. You keep the same public safety. What we find, and has been proved out through literature on this subject, is that we use about 50% more salt than we actually need to keep the public safe. It is vastly misused. So we can keep the same public safety. You increase your documentation, you improve environmental quality, and by the way, maybe we decrease your liability, because most what we heard as we started down this road from the contractors is the reason I use so much salt is I don't want to be sued. Slip and fall cases. If you all don't believe this, go to Google and type in slip and fall attorneys, New Hampshire. And it goes on about 50 pages of attorneys, and there's lots of great pictures of stock photos of people slipping on the ice. So there is an entire industry dedicated to suing these guys. So anyway, it's a fun thing to look at, and it describes my point, I think, pretty clearly. So we developed a piece of legislation that gives them the ability to have limited liability relief that's based on the ski areas. So the ski areas have a limited liability relief because, and it says kind of this in the law, that a strapping slick boards to the bottom of your feet and then going as fast as you can on a slippery hill with trees is inherently dangerous. So that's kind of what the law recognizes. And the same is true with our salt law, is that it basically recognizes that walking around in ice and snow is a dangerous activity. And if you are, unless you're negligent in your snow clearing abilities or what you're doing, then you shouldn't be held liable if you're trying to reduce to help the environment. It's good law. So anyway, we created this program. We have people, we're training people. I just wanted to just point out that it's not just surface water. This was a study done by USGS that shows that it's also groundwater. And we're about to redoing this study right now. We're about to show some more data to see where we've gone since 1985. The other thing I want to point out is that we are starting to see, and this is when I started this presentation, I said that I think that this is going to be one of the key issues over the next decade. This is statewide specific conductance. This is all of the data we have in rivers, and we have literally hundreds of thousands, millions of data points. And what we are seeing is a statistically robust increase in specific conductance statewide. And this is in every region of the state. It's not just the southern part of the state. We are very slowly poisoning the entire environment with chloride. And this shows up in ponds. We have a new lake report. You're welcome to look at it on our website. I hope you will. We have a lake trends report. This is a river trends report. It is very scary stuff. This is a, excuse me one second. My boss keeps buzzing me here. I need to respond really quick to him. One does not sort of just let their boss hang here. Hold on a
It's
second.
fine. Understood. So which one's Lake Sunapee? Upper 95 actual. So everyone knows what a confidence interval is, right? We talked about that. Okay, so you can see it looks like it has an upper 90, it's at the 95% and lower 95%. Just to let you know, Lake Sunapee is a classified Class A water, and people get their water source out of it.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, I'm gonna go back real quick. Anyway, this shows that again in lakes, Sunapee, we've seen a doubling of the specific conductance as we have in Cobbett's Pond. Cobbett's Pond is where I-93 drains. Sunapee is still very low. I mean, yes, we've seen a doubling, but it's still really super low. All right. So again, sort of how do we approach this problem? So we have voluntary approaches. We're starting to have some regulations in our stormwater regulations, and we're starting to build in some accountability. But remember the questions I asked you to think about. I think you saw a little bit about how this interacts between science, state law, and federal law. We had a federal permit for the highway. This sort of science fit into that, and we have state laws which are enforcing it. The question I haven't been able to respond to you is it effective? Is this what we're doing actually helping? Is it actually reducing salt? And the answer is we don't know. It's really, really, really hard to count salt. And if we have people who are trained, are they actually using less salt, or are they just using their Are they actually using their training, or are they just doing what they were doing before? And so this is really the challenge moving forward for all of us, is that we can do certain things from the law. We can have programs that give incentives for people to do things, but ultimately we don't really know if they're doing it. We won't know for 20 or 30 years until that salt actually, if it is reduced, we actually start to see those reductions in the groundwater that's flowing into these watersheds. So this is a really interesting thing. One of the ways in which this is also about to get harder for everybody is EPA is about to update its chloride standard. They provide us with guidance on how to set water quality standards, because setting water quality standards is really hard. It takes a lot of data, a lot of science, lots of fish studies, all kinds of stuff. And it's very likely that when they do that next year, we're going to see the numbers drop from 230 to some other number. And that is going to cause all kinds of chaos with all kinds of regulations throughout the state. And anyway, stay tuned, because this is going to get crazier and crazier.
Ted, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Would it be possible to regulate the application or purchasing of chloride, or not chloride, but just road salts? Or are there other states that have models for how they've reduced their salt loads that could be applied in New Hampshire?
Right. Great question. So are other states being successful? Here and there. There are success stories everywhere. There's some great work going on in Ontario, in the Waterloo area of Ontario, which is near Toronto. There is some great work going on Lake George, New York. Really good work in Minnesota, sort of taking a similar approach to our approach with training. But they have other issues. They have huge water softener issues, which is kind of an easier thing to take on. I mean, it's still hard, but it's a lot easier to take on. So the answer is really, we don't know if there are other people that are having much better results on a broad scale than we are. Um, and the But one thing we could be doing is funding this a little better. So we also haven't thrown a lot of resources at this issue. One of the things that I'd like to try to do is, $1 a ton. If I got $1 a ton to run chloride reduction programs, I would have a pretty big program because we put down millions of tons. So we could build a program which would put, low interest loans for small contractors to buy equipment to do some of this reduction. It could measure things. We could be able to, experiment with chloride substitutes. We could do all kinds of things if we had some resources. Not to mention, we could start to educate the public because we have this expectation. One of the reasons why salt use has increased much, much faster than population has, or development, or acres of development, or roadway development, is because there is an expectation by the public that it is your God-given right as an American to get to Walmart no matter what the conditions are outside. This is not Russia. No, this is America. We get to go to Walmart when it's snowing, and we get to drive 70 miles an hour to get there. That's what we get to do as Americans. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but we also have this expectation that has grown, and I see this just over the last, I think, 10 or 15 years, that when you're walking through a parking lot, that it crunches under your feet. It didn't used to be that way. And it isn't supposed to be that way. Remember what I said about rock salt? It doesn't even work when it says rock salt. It only works when it's in solution. You can't see the solution. So if you're stepping on it, it's not doing anything. You go to parking lots where you see drifts of salt. They're sort of more dangerous than the drifts of snow sometimes. So, we have a cultural issue, and that cultural issue needs to be addressed addressing cultural issues is way harder than addressing legal or other technical issues.
So I want to expand on Jack's point, because whether he knows he's saying it or not, I'm going back to your economics undergrad, is basically, putting the price signal where it should be, so you internalize the externality, so that you make it such that people understand they're going to be paying a lot of money for using salt any place, because there's going to be a surcharge on it, and that surcharge can go fund education.
So here's what the costs of salt are right now. If you are a large contractor or a municipality, you can buy rock salt for $63 a ton. If you're a small contractor, you can buy it for, maybe $100 a ton. You will go through a small contractor. I was talking to a small contractor the other day who has, I think, 10 parking lots, and he's buying $20,000 worth of salt for 10 parking lots.
Mm-hmm.
Our Department of Transportation buys hundreds of thousands of tons. This doesn't even start to count, the bags of salt that are sold, which if you were to buy that by the ton out of the bag, it would be hundreds of dollars per ton.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to, in order to create a price pressure on that, you'd have to double, triple, quadruple. And remember that part of this is that we don't have good substitutes. So what does that do to public safety? So these are really, really hard problems. I think chloride is one of the hardest problems we face as a contaminant. I think it's harder than nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly harder than things like PFAS. It is super difficult. And then one of the most difficult parts of it is that there's no treatment. You can't treat for salt coming off of a parking lot. There's no best management practice. So you remember those closed systems? Remember we went from open system to closed system? Those closed systems are awesome. They're treating phosphorus, and they're treating total suspended solids and bacteria and PAHs and metals and all kinds of great things they're trapping. But they're also funneling directly the salt into the into the waterways. And that's where you see here, since they did the construction at Dinsmore and around 2015, you're seeing the salt content dramatically increase. Why? Because instead of going to groundwater and taking a long time to get there, it's going to surface water and getting there immediately. Now, in the long run, this is a good thing because it's also going to flush out faster because water is flushing through better. But in the short run, it's going to be very painful. So I'm going to move on unless anybody has any questions about chlorides. That's my tale of chloride woe.
Okay, go ahead, Abby.
Okay, I was actually just wondering sort of what you guys are doing in terms of climate change, because if that's obviously supposed to increase like storm frequency and intensity, how would that impact like chloride retention within watersheds? Like before you showed that chart with a drier scenario extending retention because it decreased base flow discharge pretty much. So
yeah, so there's lots of I mean, climate change causes lots of interesting questions. More droughts mean we're probably going to see worse conditions in the summertime in salt affected areas. Certainly, I think that's an issue. So a couple of other things related to climate change. One is that the application rates that they use in the upper part of Quebec are very, very low. They use almost no salt whatsoever because it's cold, and salt doesn't work. Rock salt doesn't work below about 20 degrees at all. So they use almost none. If you look at the application rates in Virginia, in Maryland, Connecticut, they're way higher than ours. So as our climate becomes more like Connecticut and eventually more like Virginia, what we see is we see more storms that are right at that freezing thaw line. And because you don't know how it's going to change, over that line or under that line, we see more salt use. So that does not bode well for our future. We've got to figure this out, how to use the right amount of salt, when, where, and how.
So what I was going to say, have you been following C.C. Chen's work up at Dartmouth around chlorides and possible correlation with Lou Gehrig's disease?
No, I know about the work on cyanobacteria.
Yeah.
And ALS.
Yeah, but I mean, I think she's starting to look at salt too.
Interesting. Wow, that's weird.
Well, what you're trying to do is eliminate everything except the one you're trying to find.
Right. Yeah, it's hard because everything is salt is increasing a lot. It's interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking is like, the background's increasing, so it's almost impartial. It's in the possible.
Well, one of the interesting things also that people are looking at, and this actually does come back to cyanobacteria, the relationship between salt and cyanobacteria, is that they did some studies like this in Canada and I think in Minnesota, where they looked at the higher the salt content in these small tributaries coming into lakes. What it's doing is instead of the nutrients that are coming in out of those tributaries, instead of them coming out and then spreading out over the lake into the upper part of the lake, because salt water sinks, it's essentially changing the entire density of that input of water and sinking it right into the hypolimnion of those lakes, into the deepest part where it can't escape. And it's there in the hypolimnion where cyanobacteria originates. It's because it floats upwards. It gathers its nutrients as it's down in the bottom. And as it comes up, it gathers more nutrients and then blooms up. And that's when we see it. It's alive and well down in the bottom of the lake all the time. And so what you're seeing is you have this potential to really feed cyanobacteria in changing the density of water that's moving into these lakes. It's kind of a scary, fascinating subject.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so physics happens,
Mm-hmm.
Any other things on chloride? It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yep.
It's a really good, I think it's just a very good help. And if you want to try to understand how all this stuff is kind of connected, it's got a lot of connections.
Any final questions on chloride before we move on?
I guess I find myself just wondering, like, what is the solution? No pun intended. And I think that, I mean, I guess it sounds like just flush and prevent further contamination.
So
Slash what are other solutions? I guess I hear you naming a lot of problems, and we can't. Desalinization is like wicked expensive, so that's not really going to happen.
there is no treatment solution at this time.
Okay, I get.
None.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
There's none. There is no treatment solution. The only solution, and this is the sort of, this is the hard part of this. The only solution we have is to use less. That's all. That's the only thing we can do. And you know, given the way society is, using less is really, really hard.
Yeah.
You can put that across all kinds of different societal ills. I just watched, if you haven't seen it yet on Netflix, have you seen The Social Dilemma? It's a great docudrama about social media and how social media is feeding sort of social unrest. It's really fascinating, super scary, almost as scary as salt. So any other questions or comments, discussion? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Ted. Relative to using less, I'm thinking about how COVID has caused a lot of people to work from home now,
Right.
possibly decreasing driver hours in traffic on highways. That combined with, is there any possible consideration that solid road salt could be banned? Like, doesn't the EPA have regulatory authority in an extreme case to ban its use if there is something else better, in which we think brine is because we use less salt?
So yeah, I mean, brine is salt, brine is chlorides. I mean, let's not be mistaken. It's just you're just using less of it. It's more efficient.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's already a toxic substance. I mean, chlorides, when you go look at my water quality standards, which is, if you like to look at rules, administrative rules, which is super fun, go to ENVWQ 1700, and there's a table on there, 1701.1 or something like that. There's the table of all of our, what I call our table of methyl ethyl death. It's basically all of the toxic chemicals that are out there, and chlorides sits pretty much right next to chlordane. I mean, it's already a toxic, it's already treated as a toxic material. So we already have that. In terms, there are areas that are low salt areas. There are areas that are no salt areas, but you have to accept that there's a trade-off, because if you trade off, say, for example, sand for salt, sand clogs up the storm sewers, and it has lots and lots and lots of phosphorus attached to it. That phosphorus is going to go into whatever water body it's draining to, and you're going to end up with potentially then, other kinds of issues that happen in that water body. And you have infrastructure issues then, and you may be filling that water body with sand, which happens a lot, and we see that all over the place. So all of these have trade-offs, but I do like the question about COVID. I mean, in this state, we went from almost zero telecommuting just in our state government to sending everyone home in a week. That was how I spent last few weeks, the early few weeks of March, was figuring out how to send all of my employees home. And we've identified that we can work quite effectively from home. Thank you. Even though nobody ever trusted us to do that before. and we can actually be productive, maybe even more productive than we were before. Why doesn't every time there's a snow emergency in the future after COVID, if there is an after COVID, that the governor says, okay, state employees stay home. That takes 10,000 cars off the road right there. And if he says the same thing, or she says the same thing to all of the private companies, hey, snow emergency, keep your people home. Hey, about schools, you can do schools remotely. We just proved you could. We just did it for a year. All right, so everyone stay home. At that point, what you end up doing is you allowing more time, because the real secret to reducing salt use is to do a better job of plowing. It's the mechanical removal of the snow and ice that is what keeps people safe. It's not the salt that keeps people safe. It's the removal of snow and ice. So if you can do that with mechanical means, then you're not doing it with chemical means. You should see the equipment they use on airports, because where they can't use chlorides at all. They use huge equipment, really expensive brushes and blowers and all kinds of interesting things. And they're out there getting the first flake. And so that you have mechanical use, they mechanically take the snow off. They have snow melters to get rid of the snow right there. So, it is possible if you throw enough money at it. And will.
Yeah, will.
All right. Well, this is fun. Any other discussion or questions?
Yeah, I don't want to send you off on a whole nother tangent, but Dave's point raises the issue of why doesn't the policy for transporting people change for the state of New Hampshire, where they really are putting a lot more emphasis on train modalities and multiple modalities at the train stations?
There's an interesting question. Well, car is king, and it has been for the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years now. And it's the automobile which has driven our development, and it's getting people to places until the last 6 months. That has been what caused economic growth for those companies that, have facilities that build things. It's been sprawl, which is driving a lot of economic growth. It's also sprawl that's driven a lot of economic pain. I think there's lots of studies that show that. So there's also a feeling in a lot of New Hampshire that somehow trains need to be subsidized. And that generally is true. If you're going to have a train, it's got to be subsidized because it doesn't actually pay for itself. What that ignores is the fact that we just funded the expansion of I-93, which is the largest infrastructure project in the history of New Hampshire. $750 million was spent on that road, 19 miles of Interstate 93. If that's not a subsidy, I don't know what a subsidy is. We are subsidizing cars enormously. The fact that it costs $8 million to run a year to run a train from Manchester to Lowell doesn't seem so bad when you just spent $750 million on one highway that you now have to maintain for eternity and replace at some point. So the fact is that the economics of it are warped, in my opinion, and that until we sort of get our arms around that, we're going to continue to have challenges trying to get people out of cars. So anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about resilience. The climate change has come up a couple of times here. How am I doing on time? Where am I? Okay. 3, we're at 3:30, right? That's finish time? Okay. Yeah, so certainly, climate change is real. I just want to make sure everybody understands that. If you're not aware yet, there's some great studies show that. What we're seeing is that it's already changed. The climate has already changed in New Hampshire. And you've seen some of those studies. Michael has done some of those studies showing that we've already crossed the threshold of having more precipitation and fewer events. Great. If you looked at my website, you may have come across, if you weren't just too pained in looking at it from the first place, our ice out data. So we have lake ice out data that's showing that lakes are icing in later and icing out earlier every year, which has lots of implications across how lakes set up with their trophic status, how lakes set up with their levels, the various different the limnologic levels within the lake. It has an effect on lake browning, which is a new effect that we're starting to see, which is higher DOC coming into lakes, dissolved organic carbon. We may be even seeing that in rivers, we don't know, but it seems that a lot of the challenges that we see with nutrients are highly related to increasing DOC as well as increasing nutrients. So, there's something there as well. So obviously climate change is a challenge. And, one of the ways that we see that is in droughts. And if we're going to see more rain and fewer events, it means that in between, we're going to have longer periods with fewer rainstorms. That is the flip side. It's hard to see one without the other. So everybody's worried about floods and everybody's worried about these giant precipitation events. But we have the flip side in that we're seeing that also within the last 6 months, when we are in some parts of the state over a foot deficit in precipitation this year. So even though it's been really gross this week, I've had my rain gauge going the whole week, and we are at less than a half an inch of rain this entire week, and we have to make up a foot deficit. So we are still, my friends, very much in drought, and probably will be if we don't start getting some real inches of rain. Next spring looks ugly. So anyway, one of the things that I'm gonna just move along here. This shows my point. This is on our website. My guess is you probably didn't find this. This is on our we have called our dashboard. We have an environmental dashboard, and it has some cool stuff in it. It has some cool graphs. This is one of the graphs. This happens to be the Oyster River in Durham, and you can see that this is historic flows for each day. So you take all of the flows from, say, this day in February, and you average them across all the data across all the years for February 1. And you can put it into these groups, which is, 75%, 25%, and then that middle in between. So this is the median sort of down the middle. And you can see that this year we started out kind of middle. We had a low point in late spring, looked okay for a couple minutes, and then we've had some of the lowest flows ever. I actually think this is probably an anomaly, this really low point here. I don't think it ever got to zero. That's probably bad data, but it's what we got. So we see here that we have had, this is a deep drought. This is probably the deepest drought. In many ways, it's the deepest drought we've had since maybe even the 60s. So this is what I always say when I start the Instream Flow program conversation, is that when I graduated from graduate school, my first job was working for the Merrimack River Watershed Council. And the first thing I worked on in 1993 was New Hampshire's Instream Flow rules. And we finally finished those rules about 4 years ago. So you have to be patient when it comes to water policy. So in-stream flow is really, how do we make sure that there's enough water in our rivers for people and critters? That's pretty much it. It's a real simple concept, is that as we start increasing development, as we start having more and more people taking more and more water for more and more uses, how do we ensure that at the end of the day, when things get dry and things start getting dry, we have enough water for people and fish? So the idea is really to integrate all of these things together. Good in-stream flow protection ought to be a level playing field so that everybody's under the same rules. It ought to integrate lakes and rivers, because it's important to think about lakes. If you have a lake, we'll call it Pawtuckaway Lake. Anybody know where Pawtuckaway is? It's over in Raymond. It's a big lake, kind of an interesting spot. Great climbing over there, I guess, actually. Um, the that lake holds 15% above it of the watershed that drains into the Lamprey River. So if you're thinking about this, that basically what do dams do on these lakes? They stop all of the water from leaving for the entire summer. So that's 15% of the base flow. That is the base flow of the river, which is gone. It's sitting in that storage. It's sitting in that lake. That's 15% that isn't in the rest of the river that would be feeding all of the fish, everything that's evolved to be on that river. People forget that these lakes have a huge impact on the downstream flow because they essentially lock that up. And so that flow is essentially locked up. And it doesn't come out in the summer because there's people that have very expensive lake homes and they really don't like it when the lake goes down and they're not able to enjoy the lake the way that they would like to. And so this drives a lot of policy as to how we think about the integration between our rivers and lakes and watersheds. Good policy always requires great public outreach and public participation. And good policy requires really good science. And it ought to be specific to the rivers. So I will tell you that every river in this state behaves differently because it has different geology, it has different sizes, it has different latitudes. And the way in which it's used, the land use in those rivers is different. So we see very, very different things that occur in different rivers at different levels. A one-size-fits-all policy will not work. And that's what I was trying to work on back in '93, and which failed miserably because no one was well served by it. So this is essentially what we've done as a state. Here's the long sordid history. You can see that 1990, the first RSA 483, which has the Rivers and Lakes program, also includes in-stream flow. I mentioned that there was lots of controversy around the policy until 2001, and then what they said is, okay, let's just try to do two rivers. Let's not try to attack the whole thing at once. So they began working on pilot project, and those pilot projects were eventually completed in 2015. I really came on the scene again from the early days. I left for a long time, came back. 2011 is when I came in and really helped to get us to the point where we completed the pilot and did the rulemaking. And so we've now begun work on two more rivers, the Cold River and the Warner River. And hopefully we'll get to the Ashwaylet next because that will be exciting. And it's a beautiful river, as you know, if you've traveled around that part. That's where Antioch is. And then hopefully in the future, we'll be able to have more dollars. It's expensive to do this because it requires a lot of science. So what is this program? Well, basically, the first thing we do is define a protected flow. And what it does is we look at the biology and the hydrology of the river historically. So what was the target? What was here originally as fish? Where does it sit in the state? What should have been that fish assemblage that we would find here? And what are the flow needs of those fish assemblage, and as well as other critters? And then we look at the historic flow pattern. How is it managed? How is it different? And then you basically push all of that data through a couple of different habitat simulation models. And then what you get out of that is you get a number that it has a magnitude. So how many CFS is it? And it's by season because rivers are not all the same. The flow back in July is not what we'd expect the flow to be in November. So it has to be season specific. And it has to have a duration. It's not just that rivers get low, it's how long do they get low? That's what drives a drought. A drought isn't just a low point in the river. It's how long is it down there? And then how often does that happen? And is it variable? Do we have some variability over time? Is it the same flow all the time? So these are the elements of what makes an effective flow policy, because you have to incorporate all of those things. Why? Because that's what the fish are adapted to. They're adapted to changing conditions. They're adapted to changing magnitudes, durations, and frequency. And there are winners and losers in all of that. there are winners in high flows and there's winners in low flows. And that's kind of the nature of the beast. So the first thing you do is really figure out that historic, that flow. What's the flow? What's the duration? Then you figure out how do you manage to that flow. And the way I like to put this is that we're trying to, what the first part of this study does is it figures out what's the difference between normal flow, normal low flow, and abnormal low flow, that which is actually sort of induced by humans. So how do we distinguish between those? And that's what the protected in-stream flow is that distinguish between what's normal low flow and what's abnormal low flow. And if it's abnormal low flow, well, what do you do about it? Well, so we develop water management plans that apply to water users. So what do they have to do when we get abnormally low? And it applies to some dam owners, where what we do, if it gets low enough, long enough, is that we use some of that stored water. Remember, they're storing 15% of the watershed in Pawtuckaway. So we release a little bit of that, and it's a tiny amount. It makes the lake go down by, I tell you, I did this about 1,000 times at meetings. This is how much the lake goes down when we do a 2-day pulse. This much. My joke was I always drink this much scotch. So this is even less than that. So anyway, it's probably funnier to me.
So, Ted, what doesn't the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service already have a minimum flow that's required?
Yeah, but that is so arbitrary.
I know, but
It's completely arbitrary, and it's not really required. It's not required. It's
okay.
only required under certain conditions, like a FERC permit. And the fact of the matter is that that's a small portion of the rivers in the state are managed. And the studies that go on in FERC incorporate a lot of the same elements that we're incorporating here. So some of those facilities actually do have low flows, which are much more specific to their rivers.
Want to explain FERC to people, just they know the acronym?
Yeah, it's one of them FERCing acronyms is what it is. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they're the ones who regulate hydropower. And there's a long, horrible process to regulate hydropower that happens every 40 years. So we have like one bite at the apple every 2 generations on these hydro facilities. And most of them are up for relicensing right now. It's enormous workload right now. So we have these management plans that go with our protected in-stream flows. And so this is what it kind of looks like. I'll walk you through this just a little bit. You can see the dates along the bottom. And at the top, along the top here, you see these different periods. And these are just sort of shorthand names for the different hydrologic seasons that we have during the winter. There's a spring season, there's a summer season, there's a sort of fall season, and so we have 6 hydrologic seasons that occur during the year. And for each of those seasons, we identify sort of what's a normal sort of low flow. This is sort of that normal low flow, common protected flow, kind of happens a lot. But if it happens long enough, we'd get worried about it. And then you see that there's a rare and a critical flow, and these are often very close together, and certain bioperiods different in other periods. And each of those has a magnitude associated with it, as well as a frequency. So it gets below, and this is where you see these red, the little red diamonds along here show when the water was below each of these levels. And you can see this year, here we got to August, and right here on August 16th, we did a pulse release. So we released water from Pawtuckaway and Mendham's Pond, and it boosted the water back up to here. We were trying to get above here, but we didn't quite make it because it was so stinking dry. And that sort of reset the clock for a couple weeks. Then the water went back down. We did another pulse release, and the water went down. We did another pulse release, and then it started raining. And here we are today. We're finally above those low flow numbers. And you can see in the middle here, the number jumped up that we're trying to hit because the season changed. We would expect there to be different numbers, protective numbers between the summer and the fall, because there's really important things that happen with rearing and growth in the middle of the summer. And as we get into the fall, it's more about fish moving around and doing other things. So this is exactly how it was supposed to work, and it did work. So we have this kind of set up for two different rivers in the state, the Sauhegan and the Lamprey, and we will be doing these as we get to the other designated rivers in the state. There's 19 of them in the state, and we'll be doing this over time.
Yeah, it looks like the yellow line correlates to leaf out and leaf off as far as transpiration.
It does, because these are hydrologic seasons. And so you would expect that as respiration stops, then you start to have higher base flows, and you see that in river flows. And so this is why it's based on historic hydrology as well as the biology. And in terms of climate change, getting back to the question for a second, is that when we look at the historic flows, we're actually looking at the last 30 years, not the whole period of record. The reason is because the last 30 years are different than the previous 30 years before them. And we're seeing that in the data. So a couple of things just to sort of take away from this. I didn't really talk about the linkages between federal law and all of this. This is really all state law. However, it does come into play because we have, as part of our water quality criteria, remember good old ENVWQ 1700, we have a standard in there that says we should have it's a biological integrity standard, which basically says that nature should look like it's supposed to look. It shouldn't be too far off the deviation of what is sort of normal for our region and our species assemblages. So this does come into play in terms of our water quality standards, which do then regulate how other federal activities occur and what regulates them. And so we've been using this now, this kind of protected flow, where there are permits, where there are withdrawal permits. It helps us to understand how much water people can actually be allowed to withdraw. It also has been really useful in the two droughts that we've now tested it on, the 2016 drought and now the 2020 drought, is that it is extremely good at predicting drought. We know in these rivers, because we start actually looking at them and we have metrics, we knew a month ahead of time, 2 months ahead of time in 2016 and in 2020 that we were headed into drought, and we started having the water users in those watersheds start to make changes. So they were starting to conserve water a month ahead of when everyone else was. And that's the real benefit of doing this work, is it really links the conditions that we're seeing out in the world to actions to help avoid further degradation. We are the only state in the union that is doing it this way. This is unique. It has evolved here in a unique way. And it's really hard to do, and it's really expensive to do, but it absolutely, I am convinced that this is the way we should be managing our rivers. And finally, public participation is key. When I came into this in 2011, it was a mess, and largely because there had been horrible communication with the public. So we totally took a timeout, and we got everybody together, and I spoke at umpteen meetings of all those lake people doing this over and over and over and over again, until we got people to really understand what we were trying to do and the implications of it. And what finally did it was, once the lake people understood it, but the other big thing was this idea of a level playing field. Because what the resistance to this was by existing users who were worried that we were going to reduce what they were able to take. But we said to them, what if someone comes in upstream of you and takes all the water? Then your only recourse is to sue them. Your only recourse is the courts. What this will do is we'll create a level playing field so that any new user who comes in knows what the limitations are. They'll already know that they can't take as much water as they might like all the time. So if you're growing hydroponic tomatoes, and there's an in-stream flow study that says you're going to stop using water for hydroponic tomatoes when it gets to a certain point, and your tomatoes are completely dependent on that, you might think twice about, that's the place to put my hydroponic tomatoes. I'm going to take it over here where there's more water available, where it's easier to do that on the larger river, because that has less of an impact on the low flow periods. Because my use may be very large on a small river, but it may be very small on a large river. That's the kind of public policy that we're hoping to push forward with this program. It's really exciting. It's one of my favorite things. It's one of my, I think, proudest accomplishments is getting this over the finish line. So, discussion.
Hey, could I ask a question?
Of course.
So hearing you say that, like, for a private individual, if they're trying to site like a place for a farm or for
Sure.
like an agribusiness, and how the access to a specific volume of water being critical to their needs would influence where they would choose to pursue their business. How, if when this system is applied across the entire state, how do you think that that would that could potentially influence things like real estate markets or areas where development might be funneled to
Sure.
where this would otherwise not have been in place?
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, that's a really interesting question. One of the things that will happen is that if it's important to you enough, if having water under all circumstances is important to you enough, then what you will do is you will develop a diversity of water sources for your business. So you won't be completely dependent on just sucking that river dry.
Mm-hmm.
You will do what Durham has done, which they were previously on a designated river, and they took all of their water from there, and they would get cut off. And have to use other water supplies, which were less optimal and were harder to treat and expensive and didn't smell so good. So what they ended up doing was building an aquifer recharge area. And so what they do is they take water from the lamprey when it's very high, and they recharge an aquifer. They fill up a big sand pit, basically. And then when the water gets low, they use the water that's in that sand pit in order for their drinking water. And they refill it again when the water comes back up.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great way to do this. Golf courses can build ponds and then use those ponds during dry times to be able to water their golf courses. Farm ponds are an important aspect. So people who are putting in a brand new farm, if you absolutely have to have water, you better figure out a way that you will have water. And that means that you can't necessarily depend on that surface water. You may have to build your own, and that will add cost, certainly, but it also adds surety, because it could get so low like it did this year, where you really couldn't get any water anywhere local. And a lot of farms had their crops die. So, this is going to cause people to have to do things in different ways, but are those ways bad? They're certainly different.
Can I ask a question about kind of the mechanisms you use to regulate the flow? You mentioned dams, and maybe you could just speak to kind of the decision making around prioritizing animal passage and the natural flow of a river versus the need to retain water for these dry periods, and just kind of,
So we don't manage quite that to that depth. Where we manage is where we have a supply of water to do so. Otherwise, we're just telling people to use less. And that essentially, by using less, puts more water in the river. It's going to be fairly rare that we'll have the ability to actually do some of these management techniques, because New Hampshire, our lake system is largely it's usually in and out. Most of our dams in the state are sort of run of river. They don't hold back a lot of river. We don't have large reservoirs like they do out west. We don't have a lot of storage here, which we know during floods because we don't have a lot of storage here. So there aren't a lot of opportunities to do that. This program doesn't really pick winners and losers. It sort of applies across the board to water users. And then in terms of dams and how we use dams, it has to be ones that will actually make a difference downstream. So it has to be kind of big enough to actually stimulate flow, and big enough that it can be refilled naturally So we have to be very selective of that.
So when you say you tell people to conserve, do you mean you mandate, and that's both equally the private and public sector?
Yep. Yeah, they have a water management plan, which is enforceable by law.
Okay.
It's a powerful program. Other questions?
I'd like to touch upon blue-green algae,
Sure, yeah.
And you can go a little bit over if you want, okay? I mean,
Well, yeah, let's see where we get to. So I just to throw this up there is that when we're looking at cyanobacteria, all we're doing is really counting cells. So you have a bloom, and then we put it under a microscope, and if we get to 70,000 cells per mil, then boom, it's on the list, and we tell people not to swim there. And so for the 2020 season, we had 22 cyanobacteria advisories, and we also had 23 alerts. That means it didn't get to 70,000, but it was ugly, and you probably shouldn't have been in it anyway. So that's pretty similar to where we've been, although it looks like it's getting worse over time. Now, there's a couple of problems with this data. One is that over the last 20 years, we've worked really hard to educate people about what is cyanobacteria. And so over that 20-year period, people have started to actually recognize cyanobacteria and report it. So one of the reasons why we have increasing cyanobacteria is that we have increasing complaints about cyanobacteria, which probably in some of these water bodies were always there, always had problems at some point, but now we know about it. It's kind of like, the reason why we have so much COVID right now is because we're testing for it. Just saying. So that's one problem with the data, but I think you can sort of see this is what's sort of interesting, is that in the 2009, 2010, 2000, that area, we had sort of a bump. I think that largely reflects the fact that people were becoming more aware of cyanobacteria. I think the more modern trend is related to the fact that I think we're actually seeing an increasing trend. So, I think that it's hard to parse that out, but I think that we are seeing more problems. We're certainly seeing more severe problems, and we're seeing some scary kinds of evolution of which species are actually blooming, ones that were less toxic to ones that are more toxic. So what's driving that? We think temperature and nutrients.
That curve is logarithmic after 2012. That's not.
Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah. So, and we had the highest numbers we've ever seen a couple summers ago. We saw in the millions of cells in a couple places. We've seen blooms down in Lake Winnipesaukee, places that are generally considered to have have been relatively spared of cyanobacteria, and we're starting to learn a lot more about the toxicity. You can have high toxicity without having high counts. That's we're also starting to understand, and we're starting to actually test toxicity, which we never really have before. There's new assays you can do, ELISA tests, that allow you to test a suite of toxins. And the research on cyanobacteria is going crazy. We're learning more and more and more about the effects of it, from human effects, from ALS, that linkage, to gastrointestinal issues, to liver, a lot of liver damage kinds of issues, and even some respiratory issues that have come up from cyanobacteria. So the interesting thing about it is that it's not until the cells die that they actually release the toxins. So I just saw an interesting study or interesting presentation a couple of days ago. I caught a little bit of, where they were they had treated a water body with copper sulfate to kill off the algae, which is quite common in other parts of the country. It's not so common here. We used to do it a fair bit, but not anymore. But what they saw was the level of toxins in the water body was relatively low when they were having the bloom. Then they hit it with copper sulfate, which killed all the cells and released all the toxins, and the toxic numbers were outrageous. So, this is a problem, and the solution to this is unfortunately hard. And the solution is we need to dramatically get our nutrient situation under control. And I think that the other issue probably has something to do with warming of waters. But I don't know that linkage has been totally made yet. And evidently, to some extent, that what species actually is there in blooms may have something to do with the nitrogen as opposed to phosphorus. And that's still an open subject, and there's lots of research going on that, because we usually think of nitrogen being not very important relative to freshwater systems. We think about it being very important in saltwater systems. But I think that there's a growing recognition that nitrogen may play a more important role than we know about in some of these freshwater systems. So we have a program that we go out and we will go test. 99% of the cyanobacteria blooms we know about come in from complaints. And there's some really great tools now with cell phones and other things for us to be able to get that information. I don't know if I have anything else on cyano. Oh, this is acres of, I think, or is this, what is this? Is that the same thing? No, what did I just have? It's just basically the same curve, I guess. Sorry about that. I think I meant to have days of cyanobacteria advisories, it looks pretty similar over time. All right. Any other thoughts on cyano?
No, just the whole thing about nitrogen is new to me, so I'm going to start to do some research on that.
Yeah, the whole species, the toxic, and the toxicity of different species is an area of huge research right now.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to move along just a little bit, maybe kind of hit this really quickly. This is something that Michael's been involved in, which is some of the work out in the seacoast regarding coastal floods and coastal sea level rise. And I would really point you to these publications because they're fantastic, and they are local, and they take climate change data and they localize it, regionalize it, so that people can actually use it and digest it and make management actions associated with it. And it's really, really interesting, good work that I think is the cutting edge of adaptation and how we're going to be dealing with climate change over time here in our seacoast areas. And just quickly, a couple of pieces. This is one of the things that comes out of that is stuff like this, which allows people to be able to decide based on what level of risk they're willing to take. For example, if you are putting in a lawn, you don't really care if the sea level comes up and hits it every once in a while. If you're building a hospital, you care a lot about your risk relative to sea level rise and where you put it. And so if you are somebody who is really averse to risk, such as a hospital or some other piece of really critical infrastructure, you might want to plan on a higher level of sea level. And this allows you, these are tools that allow you to take your risk. What risk can you stand? Can you stand a 50% risk? Or could you, if you're a hospital, it's got to be less than 1%. I can't have a 1% chance of sea level rise coming in and flooding out my parking lot of my emergency room, because then I can't get anybody into the emergency room, or where I put the transformers for my emergency room, or other kinds of things like that that might be very critical. So, these are some of the, this is what you start to look at. And these are based on projections. And these are projections based on lots of assumptions. But you can also pick here, how bad do you think sea level rise is going to be based on how bad do you think climate change is going to be? So do you think that the ice caps are going to melt slower or faster? Do you think that temperatures worldwide are going to increase more or less? And so you can choose, this is sort of a choose your own adventure kind of thing, where you get to pick what's your tolerance for risk, as well as what is your sort of level of science that you're most interested in or most accepting of. And this allows you to then plan accordingly. And so where this is taking place now is extremely exciting. And the other document that's listed here, this is this one here, the guidance for using the scientific projections. We're actually now starting to use these curves to inform how people are actually building in the coastal zone. And we're actually working with communities and providing outreach to start to build these tools that they can work with people who are developing coastal sites to start thinking through how are they actually going to regulate. And then these numbers are going to start to show up in local regulations. This is a really interesting application of how you get from science to policy. And it's really exciting.
I think, haven't they already shown up in Seabrook on their freeboard regs?
That was a long time ago. Seabrook was right out there in front, and this is probably going to change some of that thinking as well. What's interesting is that if you look at this versus previous studies, in some areas the numbers actually go down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just because we get better science. We get better data, we get better resolution of data. LiDAR has changed a lot, in terms of our understanding of elevations and where water is going to go. But the real interesting piece is to get better and better at the resolution to understand the vulnerabilities. This is another piece of sort of that overall resilience, is that as sea level comes up, we have more and more, we have these tidal restrictions. And as sea level comes up, you have both harder to get the water out, which causes flooding upstream, and harder to get the seawater in, which causes the marsh to die. So these are some of the things we're looking at, is how do you try to make sure we have adequate flushing throughout the system. We're going to lose shoreline. We are losing shoreline. So are we going to, as things get warmed up and as shorelines start to move back, as sea level rise, what are we going to do? Are we going to harden everything? Or are we going to use some shoreline management that incorporates sort of green design, living shorelines, which incorporate, oyster reefs and incorporate salt marshes and intertidal zones and all of this other stuff that will help us to adapt as the water comes up? We have a choice. We have a choice to make. Are we going to harden and protect ourselves, or are we going to try to work with nature as long as we can and allow things to move around the way that they should? Salt marshes are not going to keep up with the pace of sea level rise. We already know that. So we're going to lose a lot of salt marsh. Are we going to allow that to migrate inland, or are we not going to allow it to migrate inland? So these are really, really challenging public policy questions that we're starting to get, pilot projects and such to try to understand how that's going to work. These are a couple pictures from some of those projects out on the seacoast, which are, addressing erosion, addressing long-term how we're going to deal with the rising seas. And again, vulnerabilities. We have lots of critical pieces of infrastructure that could be affected at different levels. Even at the lowest levels, we have billions of dollars of property which is in harm's way. Remember that as you start to increase the sea level, it has an impact on all of the surges that we're going to have. And if this season was any indication, we could potentially have more hurricanes and more storm surges in the future. So, we got to Hurricane Zeta. That means we went through the first 26, and then the next, whatever it is, 20, 24. Is that how many letters are in the Greek alphabet? Is it 24, 23? I can't remember. Anyway, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta. I didn't count. Anyway, sorry. Brings back my fraternity hazing days. So which by the way this worked, I don't know if anybody was in a fraternity or not, or a sorority, they may do this too, but you'd be sitting there in a lineup and the guy next to you would have to strike a match and you had to say the Greek alphabet 3 times before it burnt his fingers. So, I got to know the Greek alphabet pretty well that way. We're trying, all this stuff is expensive. There's, restoration projects. Restoration is way more expensive than avoidance. Let's be clear. Avoidance is kind of expensive too, but it's not nearly as expensive as restoration. So we have grants that are going out. We're trying to do some of that as we get dollars in to try to make that happen. Just some challenges. Communities are doing more and more and more. They're dealing with much more sophisticated problems than they ever did. And sort of capacity for local towns to deal with this is really limited. A lot of small towns in New Hampshire don't even have an engineer. They don't even have a planner. They depend on a circuit rider from their regional planning commission. And so the other thing to remember is that we have properties that are flooding now. You see, that's a parking lot. That's not the bottom of the ocean with yellow lines on it. That is a parking lot that is flooded during a king tide event. That's sunny day. That's not a hurricane. This is normal occurrence. This is going to happen more and more and more. We have a lot of conflicting state policies that would drive you away from actually being able to be resilient. We have policies that tell you to do things in a certain way that are not the way you would want them to be if you were actually going to be resilient. And so this is a tough problem. We have a project that we went through where we looked at all of the policies at several different agencies and looked at how they would need to be aligned and changed in order to deal with sea level rise and coastal hazards. And there's a lot of policy work that needs to happen. And then finally, we need this all to be actionable. We need to have, as new science occurs, we need to be able to act on it. And we need the public to understand this sort of at a gut level. And it's pictures like this which help people to understand it at a gut level. One of the things that I encourage anybody who's going into this field to look at is, and you can Google this at some point at your leisure, is there is an MIT study, and just Google Myers-Briggs and climate scientists. And what they did was they did Myers-Briggs studies of 300 climate scientists, and they compared it to Myers-Briggs tests that had been done across the general population. And if you've ever seen what a Myers-Briggs test looks like, it's got like quadrants. So it's got like these quadrants. And what you see is, if I can just this is sort of upside down and backwards in a mirror here. Anyway, so if what you see is that you see in one quadrant, you have most of the climate scientists sit over here in this cloud, right around in here. Maybe it's over here. Anyway, you have to look at the study. And the American public, on average, sits over here in a completely different and opposite quadrant in terms of their personality. And part of that personality is, how do you react to information? How do you make choices? Are they made based on science, information, or are they based on your emotion? And so the climate scientists, they base their decisions on information. The general public largely bases decisions on emotion. Does this affect me? Does it affect my loved ones? What does this do to me? These kinds of way that they're thinking. That poses an enormous problem. And that's why that's one of the reasons we have the problem we do today, and why people have been able to exploit that problem, is because we don't have good translators between people who live in this world and people who live in this world. And my friends, I'm sorry to tell you, if you are anything like me, or like Michael, or like the climate scientists, you probably sit down in this quadrant more than you do up in this one. And so it's really important that we find people who can speak those languages and be able to translate that information into those things which people can actually become actionable. That's the social science part of this that's really important. And I think, you know what? I think we're way past. I think we're just gonna stop there and not get to Great Bay because that's a longer story for another day.
Could I ask you a question, Ted?
Sure.
Kind of like a philosophical one, and it ties into no, it's good. It ties into what you were just talking about of like, how important is the holistic approach when you're making these decisions as opposed to the financial and the governmental structures, you know. I've recently learned about permaculture and really gotten a great insight into how important the holistic approach is, both at an individual level and then as a community level. So just like talking with your what is it, the Soak Up program that you guys do, what are those things that individuals can do on their own scale level to support these things? Because I guess, like, from my perspective, the biggest challenge I see is like, how do I support this, or this work? Like, what, how do I amplify these ideas? Like, that's you mentioned the issue of how do I get the information out to everyone else and make it meaningful. And it's like, I don't know. I feel like that's the biggest problem, and I just like feel lost in the solutions area.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry.
I think, well, no, I agree. I think having done this for a very long time, you take successes in very small portions. That's how you keep going to work the next day. And I think that what we see, and this is just my take on this, is that you as an individual can do a lot of things, right? I mean, we know we can as individuals. We can eat lower on the food chain. I mean, there's a huge thing that you can do that will tend to drive what's happening in the world in lots of different ways. You can drive fewer miles. You can, encourage other people to drive fewer miles and eat lower on the food chain, and socialize that in other ways. You can, weatherproof your house. You can do lots and lots of things at the personal level. You can do lots of things at the community level. You can protect land so that it doesn't become pollution sources in the future. You can convince your community to do certain activities, to change their laws in certain ways, so that when somebody goes to create a new facility, their stormwater is getting infiltrated, their stormwater is getting treated, that they're not adding more nitrogen. And if they're redeveloping a site, there's an opportunity to take something that was bad and make it much better. So there are local things that can be done which add sustainability into the system. And energy policy is a great one. I think you see communities doing amazing work on energy policy in their own buildings, their own structures, and being a good example for the others, and building around that. Statewide, you start to ramp that up. It becomes harder because there are systemic issues, that drive a lot of this. But again, we can do a better job of protecting resources. We can do a better job of asking the right questions of, do we really need more roads? I don't know. Doing some of those kinds of problem solving and looking at those and stimulating those things which we know are good, such as local agriculture, such as, a lot of other things which we know are good and are going to be helpful to, the whole. But and those are all great things to do, and we all should be doing them. But there are a lot of things are baked into the system. And I think that's the challenge that I think you're talking about, is that, most people can't walk to work because we have a system that doesn't reward walking to work. And we reward driving everywhere. We have a very hard time buying food at reasonable prices, especially if you're poor, because processed food, which should be more expensive because it takes a lot more energy to create it, should be more expensive. But it's not. It's cheaper. And so you end up with food deserts, and you end up with people with horrible issues, and that contributes to all of the other problems. So, I think we have some really big systemic things, the way that we do energy policy, all of these things which you are all very familiar with, that require great people to keep pushing on and keep trying to change. But my I think of myself as a natural resource professional, in which we're trying to make the best balances we can, and we're making the best choices we can. And I hope that when I leave this place, it's a little better than when I started. I mean, that's kind of the take that I have on this. And there's a lot that I can't do. There's choices I make that I can. Some of them are fun. Instead of driving my car to work, I bought a scooter, that gets 85 miles a gallon, and I look awesome on it. So
Thanks for sharing that.